welcome to the research desk. I want you to picture three completely distinct landscapes.
Okay, paint the picture for me.
Right. First, picture the interior of a hyperscale data center in the year 2025. You are standing in this refrigerated, cavernous warehouse. Rows upon rows of server racks stretch out into the dark, and they are just humming with the power of hundreds of thousands of Nvidia GPUs. Every single piece of silicon in that building is dedicated to a single task, which is processing the massive matrices required for artificial intelligence.
The modern engine room. I can picture it. What is the second one?
Second, I want you to picture an aerial view of a Kansas wheat field in late summer. It just stretches endlessly toward the horizon. It is an unbroken sea of millions of identical golden stalks swaying in the wind, engineered for absolute maximum caloric yield.
And the third?
Third, picture the damp, rocky soil of Western Ireland in the autumn of 1845. This is right as the potato harvest is being pulled from the earth. So ask yourself what those three completely different systems, a trillion-dollar tech business, a modern agricultural breadbasket, and a 19th century agrarian society could possibly have in common.
On the surface, absolutely nothing. But I know where you're going with this.
Exactly. They share the exact same mathematical fingerprint. They are all monocultures. They are systems where one single element dominates the environment so completely that the mathematical distribution of outcomes has basically collapsed. They have reached a state of near-zero Shannon entropy.
Which sounds incredibly efficient, by the way.
It is efficient, yes. But because of that specific mathematical reality, they are all structurally waiting for a catastrophe. I am arguing that this extreme concentration, this low-entropy monoculture, is a structural vulnerability. It is a trap waiting to spring.
And I am going to argue the exact opposite. I mean, this precise low-entropy state is not a disease. It is the fundamental requirement for building an unassailable competitive moat. It is how you generate historic value.
Well, to understand the danger, we have to move past viewing a company through the lens of its brand, or, its current stock price. At its core, a business model is simply a probability distribution over its revenue sources. Its Shannon entropy is its resilience.
So we are talking about a literal mathematical measurement here.
It is not a metaphor. It is a computable measurement of how close a system is to failure. High entropy means diversity, resilience, adaptability. It means your company's exploring multiple hypotheses about the future all at once. Low entropy means a single narrative dominates your entire existence.
For those who might not spend their weekends calculating Shannon entropy, how do you visualize that?
Think of it like the game of 20 questions. Entropy is simply a mathematical measurement of how much surprise exists in a system, or how many yes or no questions you need to ask to figure out an outcome.
Okay, so if I have a loaded coin that lands on heads every single time, there is zero surprise.
Exactly. You need to ask zero questions to know what the next flip will be. The entropy is zero. But if you have a perfectly fair coin, you have maximum surprise. So when we apply this to corporate revenue, we are measuring the surprise in where a company's next dollar comes from.
And we can measure this directly from the financials.
We can. We can look at the most powerful companies on Earth, the Magnificent Seven, and calculate their revenue entropy using their own SEC filings. We take the percentage of revenue from each segment, calculate the proportion, and apply the Shannon entropy formula.
Which is the negative sum of each proportion multiplied by the base 2 logarithm of that proportion.
Right. So when we run the numbers for Meta, we find a company where 98% of its revenue is derived from a single source, digital advertising. If you play 20 questions with Meta's revenue, the answer is always advertising. So what is their actual entropy score?
Meta's entropy sits at approximately 0.4 bits. That is dangerously low. It is a highly optimized, incredibly profitable monoculture. But then, run the math on Amazon.
Amazon is a totally different beast. You have Amazon Web Services, the e-commerce retail marketplace fees, digital advertising subscription services like Prime.
Exactly. Amazon's entropy sits at roughly 1.6 bits. Amazon is a diversified ecosystem. Meta is a single crop.
I see the contrast you are drawing.
So present the contrast to yourself. When a macroeconomic shock hits, Say a fundamental change in privacy tracking, like Apple's app tracking transparency, or a massive shift in consumer behavior. Which immune system is structurally equipped to survive? The company at 0.4 or the company at 1.6?
I think you're analyzing a snapshot rather than a motion picture. You're fundamentally misinterpreting the life cycle of capital here. How so? The math is the math.
Because you are comparing the mature, highly diversified Amazon of today to a theoretical standard. You are not acknowledging the causal mechanism of how Amazon actually survived to reach an entropy of 1.6. You cannot reach that state of high entropy resilience without first surviving and dominating as a low entropy monoculture.
But Amazon was always building toward that diversity.
Let us trace Amazon back to its origin. In its early days, Amazon was just a bookstore. It sold physical books over the internet. Its revenue entropy was virtually zero. It was a pure play on digital retail for a single category.
True, but that was just the starting point.
And Wall Street ruthlessly rewards that concentration. Analysts demand focus because without that initial collapse of the distribution into a single, dominant narrative, you never build the infrastructure required to dominate an industry.
You were saying the monoculture is a necessary phase.
It is the wedge. That specific concentration in books built the logistics network. It built the customer trust. It created the everything store, which eventually funded the massive, unprecedented capital expenditure required to build Amazon Web Services. You simply cannot skip the monoculture phase.
I agree it builds the initial wedge, but staying there is the trap.
Well, let us examine the company that defines the current technological era. Look at Nvidia. Nvidia's data center revenue grew from 40% of its total revenue in 2020 to an astounding 78% by 2025.
And their entropy plummeted accordingly.
Yes, and over that exact same time frame, the stock price exploded from roughly $15 to $140. Every incremental dollar of data center revenue flowed straight into a single clarifying narrative.
The narrative that AI is eating the world.
Exactly. And Nvidia provides the only functional hardware to facilitate it. Wall Street rewarded that low entropy because it represented a pure, unadulterated bet on a paradigm shift.
But what happens when that shift stalls?
If Nvidia had deliberately constrained its data center growth just to maintain a higher entropy score across its legacy gaming or automotive segments, it would have starved its greatest opportunity. You are looking at the pinnacle of business achievement, the exact mechanism of value creation, and diagnosing it as a terminal illness.
The value creation is undeniable. I am not disputing the efficiency of a monoculture. It is the fragility of that system that I am highlighting.
So break down the fragility. Why is 78% concentration a structural threat?
To understand the specific danger of what Nvidia has built, we have to trace the mathematics of Shannon entropy back to its origin. The formula we use to calculate revenue entropy was not invented by Wall Street analysts. It was published by Claude Shannon in 1948 at Bell Labs.
Originally to measure information loss over copper wires, right?
Right, exactly. But its most profound application happened when ecologists adapted it in the 1950s. Robert MacArthur, in 1955, realized that Shannon's formula for information surprise perfectly described ecosystem resilience.
So it crossed over from information theory into biology.
It became known in biology as the Shannon Diversity Index. It is literally the same equation applied to species abundance instead of revenue segments. So consider a mature rainforest.
Okay, a high entropy environment.
A rainforest contains tens of thousands of distinct species of flora and fauna, all interacting in this deeply complex web. Its Shannon entropy score is extraordinarily high, usually hovering around 4.5. And because of that immense mathematical diversity, the rainforest can survive massive climate perturbations.
It can survive droughts, floods.
It has survived ice ages. If a specific fungal disease wipes out one species of tree, the canopy is simply filled by a different species. The energy flow of the system just reroutes.
And the corporate equivalent of that rainforest would be who?
Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire's operating earnings are split across insurance, railroads, energy grids, manufacturing, retail. Its revenue entropy is incredibly high. No single segment overwhelms the others.
So a railroad strike does not bankrupt the insurance float?
Exactly. Now compare that high-entropy architecture to a modern wheat field. The wheat field contains exactly one species of plant, engineered to possess the exact same genetic profile. Its entropy is roughly 0.3.
Very low, but incredibly productive.
Extremely productive, per acre. It yields an immense, easily harvestable caloric surplus, but it is entirely incapable of surviving a targeted shock. A single specialized pest, a specific strain of rust, or a sudden freeze can wipe out the entire field in a matter of days.
So you are saying Nvidia is the wheat field?
Nvidia currently is the wheat field. Its data center dominance is incredibly productive. It yields these historic margins that the market is rightly celebrating. But mathematically, structurally, it is fundamentally fragile.
Here is the problem with your biological theorem. The rainforest produces absolutely no surplus.
What do you mean? It produces immense biomass.
Think about the mechanics of an ecosystem with an entropy of 4.5. A jungle consumes every single calorie it generates just to maintain its own complex equilibrium. It is a closed loop of constant competition.
That is how natural resilience works, yes.
But human civilization does not eat jungle. Human civilization eats the output of managed, low-entropy ecosystems. We eat the wheat field.
But that managed ecosystem requires constant artificial protection.
Because the extreme, engineered productivity of the monoculture is the exact mechanism that allows human populations to scale. It allows cities to be built. Just as the extreme productivity of a focused business model is what allows capital to compound.
I am not arguing against capital compounding. I am arguing against the vulnerability it creates.
You are praising Berkshire Hathaway for its high entropy, but Berkshire Hathaway was built by acquiring companies that possessed low entropy in their specific verticals.
Well, they acquired category leaders, yes.
Right. Geico is a monoculture of auto insurance. BNSF is a monoculture of freight rail. You are confusing the portfolio construction of a holding company with the operational reality of a competitive business.
No, I am measuring the resilience of the total entity.
If a single operating business attempts to act like a rainforest, spreading its resources across thousands of uncoordinated initiatives, it generates no surplus. It dies of starvation.
But the surplus of the wheat field is precisely what lures a system into the monoculture trap. The body count of the biological monoculture is a matter of historical record, and the parallels to corporate concentration are exact.
So let us hear the historical record then.
We have to look closely at the Irish potato famine of the 1840s to understand how a low-entropy system actually fails. In the decades leading up to the 1840s, roughly 3 million people, a full third of Ireland's population, became dependent almost entirely on a single cultivar of potato.
The Irish lumper.
The Irish lumper. The tenant farming system had pushed laborers onto these increasingly marginal, rocky plots of land, and the lumper was an agricultural miracle for those specific conditions. It provided massive caloric density in terrible soil.
It fueled a massive population boom.
It did, but they did not just rely on potatoes in general. They relied on one specific genetic clone. The food supply of an entire nation had been engineered down to near-zero crop entropy.
And then the environment changed.
The mathematics of a near-zero entropy system are pitiless. When the entropy is approximately zero, the probability of total system failure given a targeted pathogen approaches 1. The system has literally no structural defense.
So in 1845, the blight arrived.
Yes, Phytophthora infestans. It crossed the Atlantic on ships and swept through the damp Irish fields. Because every single lumper shared the exact same genetic vulnerabilities, the destruction was absolute.
The potatoes just turned to mush in the ground.
Black mush. There was no fallback variety planted. There was no alternative crop capable of replacing the caloric deficit. 1 million human beings starved to death. Another million were forced to emigrate.
A staggering collapse.
In a span of 7 years, the population of Ireland fell by 25%. This is not an abstract ecological theory. It is the mathematical certainty of the monoculture trap. When you collapse the variance to 0, you invite total ruin.
And you see the same dynamic happening today?
We look back at the 1840s and view that reliance on the lumper as a tragic historical miscalculation. Yet look at modern industrial agriculture.
The United States Corn Belt plants roughly 80 million acres of corn annually.
And it feeds a massive portion of the globe.
But the top 5 hybrid varieties cover more than 50% of that entire acreage. Crop entropy in the United States Midwest is actually lower today than it was in the 1950s, back when mixed farming and crop rotation were the standard.
So you are saying we are mathematically just as vulnerable.
We have built the most productive agricultural system in human history, but it rests on a razor's edge. We are one specific blight away from a global commodity disaster, and the parallel to the technology sector is precise.
Back to Nvidia.
Nvidia's data center revenue is the Irish lumper of Silicon Valley. It is spectacularly, historically productive. It feeds the entire artificial intelligence ecosystem.
But you think the blight is coming.
If a single blight hits that specific cultivar, whether that is a massive breakthrough in custom silicon by Google or Amazon, or a geopolitical regulatory crackdown on graphics processor exports, or just a sudden data center capex recession, Nvidia has no fallback variety. The distribution is too concentrated.
You look at the Irish lumper, and you see a tragedy of nature. But look at the corporate landscape. A company does not accidentally fall into a single revenue stream.
No, they are pushed into it by the pursuit of margin.
The most dominant companies on Earth engineer that concentration intentionally, because they recognize that scattering their capital across a high-entropy portfolio ensures mediocrity.
Mediocrity is better than extinction.
Let us examine the mechanics of TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company. TSMC is the ultimate concentrated moat. They operate in exactly one product category, which is contract semiconductor manufacturing.
Right, they do not design the chips, they just build them.
They have exactly one technology focus, leading-edge nodes, and they serve a highly concentrated customer base. Apple alone accounts for roughly 25% of their total revenue.
So, by my mathematical metric, TSMC's revenue entropy is terrifyingly low.
They are the ultimate monoculture. Yet, that precise concentration is exactly what created the deepest technological moat in modern industry.
A moat that is entirely dependent on the physical limits of silicon not changing.
Look at the capital intensity of what they do. A modern semiconductor fabrication plant costs roughly $20 billion to construct. The extreme ultraviolet lithography machines they purchase from ASML cost $200 million each, and they require dozens of them.
The engineering involved is mind-bending, I will give you that.
They must manipulate light at a wavelength of 13.5 nanometers. They are bouncing lasers off microscopic droplets of tin in a vacuum chamber just to carve transistors into silicon.
It is practically science fiction.
But here's the point. You cannot achieve that level of physics-defying engineering if you are diversifying your capital. TSMC did not dilute their focus across consumer electronics or software development or legacy node fabless design.
Like Intel historically attempted to do.
Exactly like Intel tried to do. Because TSMC stayed focused, they were able to pour every single resource into extreme ultraviolet lithography. The result is that no competitor on the planet is within 3 to 5 years of matching TSMC's 3-nanometer and 2-nanometer manufacturing processes.
So the concentration created the advantage.
The monoculture is the moat. Nvidia did not stumble into a 70% data center concentration by accident either. They architected it.
They bet the entire future of the company on the CUDA software ecosystem back in 2006.
Long before artificial intelligence was a mainstream commercial reality, they spent billions maintaining a parallel computing platform. They cultivated an ecosystem of 4 million developers who learned their specific syntax.
Which creates a massive lock-in effect.
The switching cost for a client to leave Nvidia today is not just buying a different piece of hardware from AMD. It is abandoning a decade of embedded code. It means retraining massive developer teams. It means sacrificing deep optimization.
I can see the lock-in is profound.
Conglomerates do not build 4 million strong developer moats. Diversified businesses do not push the boundaries of physics in semiconductor manufacturing. Only focused, low-entropy entities can concentrate enough force to break through those fundamental technological barriers.
I understand the power of focused capital. The force you can apply is incredible.
But if we want to see what happens when an impenetrable moat faces a true technological paradigm shift, when the blight actually arrives, we must look at the intertwined fates of Kodak and Fujifilm.
The classic disruption case study.
But viewed through the lens of entropy, it becomes the emotional centerpiece of why this mathematical management is the difference between survival and death. Let us set the scene in 1996.
The absolute peak of the film era.
Exactly. Both of these legacy giants were operating from the exact same mathematical starting line. Both companies derived roughly 70% of their massive global revenue from the sale of traditional photographic film.
Both possessed dangerously low revenue entropy.
Both were heavily reliant on a specific chemical engineering monoculture, the manufacturing of silver halide crystals suspended in gelatin reacting to photons. And both were staring down the exact same impending blight.
The advent of digital photography.
The digital sensor was their Phytophthora infestans. It required no film, no chemical processing, and no physical supply chain.
And it fundamentally altered the physics of capturing an image.
The trajectories Kodak and Fujifilm took from that shared starting line demonstrate the precise power of recognizing your entropy state. Kodak allowed its entropy to collapse even further.
They doubled down on the core business.
As film sales slowly began to decline, they looked at the massive profit margins of their chemical business and they just clung to them. They froze. They attempted to protect the monoculture rather than adapt the organism.
They viewed digital as a low-margin accessory to their core film business, basically.
Right. And we know how that story ends. It ends in a slow bleed, culminating in bankruptcy in 2012.
A total collapse of the moat.
Now look at Fujifilm. Facing the exact same mathematical reality, they recognized the existential threat of their low entropy state. They initiated a deliberate, radical diversification strategy.
But they did not just pivot to digital cameras, did they?
No, they didn't just throw money at random industries either. They looked deeply at their core competencies and decentralized them. They understood the complex chemical process of preventing photographic film from oxidizing and fading over time when exposed to ultraviolet light.
Because film degrades if you do not treat it perfectly.
Right, they had spent decades mastering this specific chemistry. Then they realized that human skin fading, wrinkling, and aging is also a biological oxidation process caused by ultraviolet light.
Oh, wow. I did not realize the connection was that direct.
The fundamental mechanisms were linked. Furthermore, photographic film is roughly 50% collagen. Human skin is primarily collagen.
That is an incredible insight.
Fujifilm took their deep institutional knowledge of preventing collagen oxidation in film, and they pivoted it directly into human biology. They launched Astrolift, a highly successful cosmetics line, leveraging their photographic chemistry expertise.
Talk about raising your entropy.
They diversified into pharmaceuticals, specifically synthesizing influenza drugs, utilizing their chemical manufacturing capabilities. They expanded into advanced materials. They utilized their expertise in creating incredibly thin, uniform layers of chemicals to create specialized tack films.
Which are essential components in polarizing layers for LCD display screens.
Exactly. Fujifilm aggressively forced its revenue entropy upward. By 2015, Fujifilm possessed one of the highest entropy scores in the entire Japanese manufacturing sector.
They completely rebuilt their probability distribution.
They started in the exact same mathematical position as Kodak. They faced the exact same external shock, but because their entropy trajectories moved in opposite directions, they experienced entirely opposite fates. One adapted its chemistry to a high-entropy portfolio. The other died protecting the wheat field.
You are treating Kodak like a universal law of physics, but you are ignoring the companies that did concentrate, faced a massive external shock, and still proved that concentration was the correct strategy for maximizing value.
I am open to an example. Who faced a shock and won by concentrating?
Survival may require diversification in the face of a dying industry, yes, but dominance requires maintaining the monoculture for as long as the paradigm holds. If concentration is so universally lethal, explain how Nokia conquered the Earth.
Nokia is the poster child for catastrophic collapse.
But look at the peak. In 2007, Nokia commanded 51% of the global mobile phone market share, 51%. It was one of the most stunning examples of concentration in technology history.
Their revenue entropy was practically zero.
They dominated one product category, feature phones with physical keyboards, satisfying one primary customer need, which was basic voice calls and texting.
And then Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in California.
Right. The touchscreen smartphone acted as a blight to their Symbian operating system. Within 6 years, a company that once boasted a $300 billion market capitalization was forced into a massive restructuring. They ultimately sold their mobile business to Microsoft for $7.2 billion.
A massive destruction of value. Because of the monoculture.
You point to Nokia and say their monoculture killed them. I look at Nokia and ask, was achieving a 51% global market share a suicide wish, or was it the ultimate sign of winning the era?
Winning the era means nothing if you lose the company.
Nokia's failure was not their concentration. Their failure was a technological paradigm shift. Moving from physical keyboards and the Symbian OS to capacitive touchscreens and app ecosystems was not a simple pivot.
It required an entirely different capital structure.
And a completely different software philosophy. If you are terrified of low entropy, you never capture 51% of the global market in the first place. You never reach the mountaintop if you are constantly hedging your bets at base camp. Nokia won their era completely.
Nokia proves my point perfectly, though. Capturing 51% of the market is an incredible achievement. The surplus they generated was massive.
Unprecedented at the time.
But staying locked into the specific system that got you there, refusing to increase your informational entropy when the environment fundamentally changes, is lethal. The trap is believing the conditions of your dominance are permanent.
They did not see the touchscreen as a structural threat fast enough.
Nokia possessed the capital to explore touchscreens aggressively. They possessed the R&D budget to explore alternative operating systems. But they refused to cannibalize their low-entropy core. They refused to manage their distribution.
Okay, let us test the absolute boundary of your theory.
Please do.
If we follow your logic to its absolute conclusion, and we assume that monoculture is the ultimate danger, then maximum entropy must be the ultimate goal, right? A perfectly diversified company must be the most resilient and therefore the most successful.
In a purely mathematical static vacuum, perhaps.
But the data proves that assumption completely false in the real world. Let us examine General Electric under the leadership of Jeff Immelt.
A cautionary tale of a different kind.
GE achieved the absolute dream of maximum revenue entropy. Through relentless acquisitions and expansion, they possessed roughly 20 different major revenue streams, with many contributing roughly 5% to the bottom line.
They were everywhere.
They were operating in commercial aviation, healthcare imaging, commercial lighting, massive financial services and leasing, media and television, water treatment, energy turbines. It was the absolute pinnacle of high entropy diversification.
Truly a corporate rainforest.
Exactly. And if your theory holds, GE should have been the most resilient, dominant company of the century.
But they weren't.
The result was complete, paralyzing stagnation. They lacked any coherent direction because capital allocation became a political battle inside the company, spread so evenly across so many disparate segments. They had no overwhelming competitive advantage in any single vertical.
They lost their focus.
They were systematically dismantled by focused lower entropy competitors in every single category. Danaher aggressively focused its capital on life sciences and outmaneuvered GE. Siemens concentrated its engineering talent on healthcare diagnostics and crushed them. Honeywell focused on aerospace controls and defeated them.
The specialists beat the generalist.
A jungle with maximum species entropy produces no surplus. General Electric became a corporate jungle. They survived, technically, but they generated no outsized value for a decade. Maximum entropy is just a different kind of death. It is the death of excellence.
I actually agree with your assessment of General Electric.
You do?
Completely. That is the critical nuance of the mathematics here. The wild card is that optimal entropy is not maximum entropy.
Right, because maximum entropy is just noise.
Maximum entropy is directionless noise. It is an organization trying to be everything and succeeding at nothing. Minimum entropy, as we established with the Irish lumper, is extreme fragility.
So where is the middle ground?
The synthesis of our two positions. The holy grail of corporate strategy is moderate dynamic entropy. It is the deliberate modulation of concentration and diversification over time. And no company in modern history has modeled this mathematical tightrope better than Apple.
Apple is a fascinating case study for this.
Let us trace Apple's dynamic entropy over the last 2 decades. In the mid-2000s, Apple was dangerously concentrated in the iPod. The iPod represented roughly 40% of their total revenue.
It was a massive hit, but a highly vulnerable monoculture.
Completely dependent on the physical MP3 player market. Then, they did the hardest thing a company can do. They deliberately cannibalized their own monoculture.
The iPhone substituted the iPod.
Yes, and initially the iPhone grew to represent between 60 and 70% of total revenue. On paper, it looked like they had simply swapped one hardware monoculture for another. They possessed the exact same low entropy risk as Nokia.
But Apple did not stop there.
No, they used the absolute dominance in cash flow of the hardware monoculture to quietly, systematically build their services segment. They leveraged an installed base of over 1 billion devices to launch the App Store ecosystem, Apple Music, iCloud storage, Apple Pay.
The services business alone is now the size of a Fortune 50 company.
Today, services represents roughly 25% of Apple's total revenue, but crucially, examine the margins. Services operates at roughly 75% gross margins, compared to the iPhone's hardware margin of roughly 36%.
So they shifted the math.
Apple's revenue entropy rose deliberately from roughly 0.8 bits during the peak of the iPod era to approximately 1.4 bits today. They sit in the absolute mathematical sweet spot.
It is not maximum entropy. They are not GE.
No, the iPhone still anchors the entire ecosystem, but the entropy is high enough that a 20% structural decline in global smartphone sales, a shock that would have literally bankrupted Nokia, would not pose an existential threat to the corporation today. Optimal entropy is moderate and it is constantly in motion.
When you frame it as dynamic motion, it points to a very clear 4-phase life cycle framework that really governs the flow of capital and the evolution of competitive moats.
Walk me through the phases.
Phase 1 is concentration. The entropy of the business is falling. A company finds true product market fit and doubles down aggressively. Revenue concentrates heavily into a single dominant segment.
This is the massive value creation phase.
This is where the moat is excavated and filled. This is Nvidia right now with the H100 and B100 chips. This is TSMC pushing into 2-nanometer production.
And phase 2?
Phase 2 is vulnerability. The entropy is low and static. The moat is fully built. The margins are spectacular. But the company is trapped in its own success. It has become a mature monoculture.
This is the Kodak moment.
Exactly. A single external shock, a new competitor, a shift in regulation, a change in consumer behavior could be fatal. This was Nokia in 2007. This was Kodak in 2005.
Which leads to phase 3, diversification.
Phase 3 is diversification. The entropy is rising. The company realizes its structural vulnerability and utilizes the massive cash flow generated from its core moat to fund expansion into adjacent, highly profitable segments.
This is Apple building its services revenue.
Or Amazon utilizing its retail cash flow to construct AWS. Then, if they aren't careful, they hit phase 4, conglomerate risk.
The entropy goes too high.
The diversification becomes bloated and unfocused. The company loses its competitive edge because it is fighting on too many fronts without a core structural advantage. This is GE under Immelt.
And then the cycle just has to reset.
The cycle must restart. The conglomerate is forced by the market to spin off its weaker divisions, reconcentrate around a new core competency, and the entropy falls once again.
So the most profitable business is structurally the most fragile until it learns to diversify without losing its edge. That is the fundamental truth we have arrived at through this mathematical lens.
The stakes are profoundly practical for anyone analyzing a complex system.
We should all be computing the revenue entropy from the 10K filings of the entities we study. Look closely at the segment revenues, calculate the proportions, and run the formula. You can clearly identify the Christensen disruption signal in these numbers.
The innovator's dilemma.
Yes.
True disruption occurs precisely when an incumbent's revenue entropy is low and falling, meaning they are locked into protecting a single hyper-profitable core and unable to adapt to lower margin innovations, while an entrant's entropy is high and rising.
Meaning the entrant is agilely exploring multiple new hypotheses and markets.
Exactly. When you evaluate a competitive moat, you must measure its entropy, not just its depth. A business protected by network effects, deep switching costs, and massive scale economies possesses high moat entropy. It can survive the degradation of one of those pillars.
But a business protected solely by a single pharmaceutical patent possesses low moat entropy.
The exact moment the patent expires, the fortress falls.
This framework brings us directly back to the principles we established in our first analysis regarding market entropy.
The fundamental phases of change are measurable, and they are omnipresent across disciplines.
Whether we are looking at the distribution of capital across asset classes preceding a major financial crisis, or the distribution of revenue across product lines within a technology conglomerate, the mathematical laws dictate the threshold of fragility. Concentration builds the surplus, diversification protects it. You simply cannot circumvent the life cycle.
The mathematical fingerprint of the monoculture governs everything from the Kansas wheat field to the hyperscale data center. And we are going to test the absolute limits of this equation in our next deep dive.
I am looking forward to that one.
We will apply this exact framework of Shannon entropy to the ultimate historical monoculture, the Roman Empire. We will examine what happens when political and military power converges to near-zero entropy. One emperor, one standing army, one legal framework, one foundational currency like the denarius, and how that magnificent concentration of force inevitably collapsed under the weight of new information.
Exactly as the equation dictates.
This is the Research Desk officially signing off.